Okay, welcome everyone. I'll do the formal introductions in a second, just waiting for everyone to arrive. Okay, welcome. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world today. This is the third webinar on Estimands. We've had previous webinars on diabetes and in the oncology area, but today we're going to focus on a trial in the respiratory space, specifically the Ethos trial, which is a trial in COPD patients, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease patients. Okay, before we get into the example today and the presentation, I'd just like to explain the background to the webinar series. So the Estimand implementation working group was set up to implement the addendum to ICH E9, which is where the topic of Estimands and its use in clinical trials was outlined. So this is a European initiative, the EIWG for short, and you'll see that it's a combination of, or our sponsors as it were, are FSPI and FPIA, and that's on purpose. So this isn't just a statistical component to this. The EIWG brings together clinicians and statisticians to support the Estimand journey. You'll see on this slide the list of members. And on purpose, we have co-chairs, one who is a clinician, Nanko Hefting, and one who is a statistician, Chrissy Fletcher. And you'll see we have a wide range of support from clinicians and statisticians across a variety of companies. Okay, but now just getting some of the things that should be said that aren't so interesting. This is a disclaimer that the views you'll hear today are the presenters and don't necessarily reflect the views of AstraZeneca or indeed anybody else that we used to work for. I'd like to acknowledge, though, formally AstraZeneca for allowing us to use the Ethos case study today, and also for the support that FPIA and FSPI have provided supporting the webinar, and indeed PSI as well. I'd like to thank the EIWG members for their lively discussion and comments on the slides, and also the team that are supporting me today. So that's well, Sue McKendrick and Judith and Pepper and Maria. Sorry, they're not on this slide because of last-minute changes. I also thank Melanie Wright for her support, and hope she gets better soon. She won't be joining us today. Sue McKendrick will be helping us in the Q&A part of the presentation. So if you do have any comments or questions to us, please would you put them into the Q&A box, not the chat box, and then we'll go into those questions at the end of the presentation. And if we don't have time to answer all your questions, we'll try and do that afterwards. Okay, so here's the agenda for today. After formally introducing ourselves, I'll introduce the learning outcomes for the webinar, and then Paul will introduce the Ethos study itself. I'll give a reminder of the Estimand framework, and I won't spend hours on that. That's been covered in previous webinars, but of course some of the audience today, Estimands may be fairly new to you still, and so I'll give you people a reminder of the Estimand framework, and then show how it can be used in the Ethos study, and we'll develop together 3 possible Estimands that could be used today. And then we'll also give you an opportunity to vote on which one you think is the most appropriate Estimand to use here, before Paul gives his clinical view on what he thinks will be most appropriate. And then I'll shift tack towards the end of the presentation and talk about how Estimands should be communicated in medical journals. Then we can conclude, wrap up, and then will be time for questions at the end. Okay, so who are we? So I'm David Wright. I'm the Head of Statistical Innovation at AstraZeneca and also a member of the EIWG training team. I've been with AstraZeneca now about 5 years. Previously, I worked at the MHRA in the UK and had a great interest in a lot of statistical issues in the regulatory world. Was involved in the missing data guidance that was developed in 2011, and following on from that, this led to what became the addendum to ICHE 9. So that's me, but I'll just maybe hand over to Paul now to introduce himself.
Thank you. I'm Paul Durinsky. I'm a pulmonary critical care physician by background. Spent about 20 years or so in academics and was previously chairman of the Critical Care Assembly and on the board for the American Thoracic Society. And I've been in the drug development area for a number of years. Was very involved in the development of serotype Advair, which hopefully many of you are familiar with, and most recently Breztri, which is a triple combination we'll talk about in a bit.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Welcome. Okay, so the learning outcomes today. We'll talk about how we should define Estimands using simple language and identify things called intercurrent events. If you don't know what they are at the moment, we'll explain that as we go along. And we'll talk specifically about using these Estimand strategies in a trial in COPD. And then afterwards, talk a little bit about communicating these results in publications. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to Paul, and maybe if you can start, Paul, by explaining a little bit about the disease that we're of interest today, COPD.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yep, you went to the next slide, or you can go to the next slide. I hope this isn't too boring for most of you. Many of you probably know, but the disease area that we're talking about is COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and it's one of the third leading cause of deaths worldwide. It's most commonly due to cigarette smoking and involves many, many people across the globe. There are three main therapies. There are others, but the three main ones that are involved in the study we're going to talk about, but also in general, are inhaled corticosteroids. And in the study we'll talk about, that one is budesonide. It's used to reduce inflammation, very important drug for use in people that have a history of exacerbations of COPD, which are worsening events that can either lead to significant impairment of their day-to-day life or even bring them in the hospital. And then there are two bronchodilators, which are designed to reduce the constriction in the airways, the narrowing in the airways by two different mechanisms. One is the long-acting beta agonist, or LABA, and the one in the study is formoterol. And then there's an anti-muscarinic agonist, which works on smooth muscle in the airways as well, called glycopyrrolate or glycopyrronium. There are a variety of other abbreviations, most of which aren't that important to the understanding of what we're about to go through, but there are short-acting versions of those bronchodilators, which are used more as rescue treatments, and that includes things like SABA and SAMA. You'll see the abbreviation BID, it just means twice daily, and all of the drugs that we're talking about in the study were administered twice daily and were done by a meter dose inhaler, the common inhalers that have been around since the 70s, basically. And then we evaluated per the combination regulations, the triple versus the two dual combinations. Now there is a third that could be done, but the third combination isn't something that's marketed anywhere around the world. And the treatment arms in the Ethos study are shown on this slide. And there's really the triple, which we abbreviate BGF. And again, it's a steroid plus the two long-acting bronchodilators, in this case, budesonide, glycopyrronium, and formoterol. And then the two dual combinations, BFF, which is the ICS-LABA, and budesonide, formoterol alone, so only two of the three ingredients, and GFF, which is the LAMA-LABA that's only containing the bronchodilators and not the inhaled steroid. And the real question, and the question of the trial, is really to meet the required combination regulations, which is the triple superior to both dual therapies for the primary endpoint of the study, which we'll get to on the next slide. So this is the basic study design. It looks, summarizes 5 or 6 years of work on a single slide, which is a little bit interesting. But this was a huge study. There were over 8,000, almost 9,000 patients. We screened over 16,000 patients. It was done in 26 countries around the globe, and it was a 52-week study. The inclusion criteria are pretty common for people that have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. They were in the age range of 40 to 80. They had to be symptomatic while receiving 2 or more inhaled maintenance therapies in order to be able to provide some basis for showing a treatment benefit. They had to have impaired lung function, and in this study, it had to be 25 to 65%, the normal value being 80% or greater. So they were pretty severely impaired. And most importantly, they all had to have a history of a moderate or severe COPD exacerbation in the past year. And just by way of background, moderate exacerbations are ones that require a substantial addition of therapy, and in this case, either a course of inhaled steroids like prednisone or a course of antibiotics or both. And severe exacerbations are ones that those therapies are inadequate, and they actually require admission to a hospital or an intensive care unit for their management. The primary endpoint of the study was the rate of moderate or severe COPD exacerbations over the 52-week outcome period. We've done, dozens of publications on this, but the main paper is presented in the New England Journal, and we actually had the study design paper and rationale presented or published in Respiratory Medicine the year before the main manuscript was published. And we can go to the next slide.
Sorry, just there you go.
Sorry. Yeah, here we go. So it is interesting, and I can tell you this has been I majored in math as an undergrad and did take some statistics courses from Cochrane of all people, which I barely understood as an undergrad, I have to say, but been very interested in the subject of Estimands over the past year, because in essence, while trying to evaluate, provide information so that a prescriber can try to understand what happens when they give this therapy to a patient. But in a clinical trial setting, it's a bit different. And there are 3 or 4 different pathways that are just in broad bucket terms that can happen to a patient. They can complete the study as planned and take their therapy all the way out for 52 weeks, which the majority of subjects in the study do. Patients can discontinue therapy for 2 common reasons. Patient number 2 representing somebody who developed lack of tolerability. They had an adverse event that was related, that the investigator in a blinded fashion thought was related to the treatment they were giving in the study, and they had to be discontinued from treatment because of the adverse event. And so they don't actually complete all 52 weeks of treatment. Similarly, and much more common in a study like this, is people who discontinue due to lack of efficacy. They get in the study. These are people who are exacerbating. Some of them may have been on more intensive therapies and got randomized to a less intensive therapy. And so they develop an intercurrent event, which is linked to the drug not working, and then they're prescribed another therapy, while either continuing in or not continuing in the study. And then there are a host of other miscellaneous topics, which are summarized under the patient 4, which patients discontinue study for all kinds of different reasons. They don't have time to participate anymore. They move, something happened in their family, and they can no longer take the time out to do it, so they have to discontinue treatment. And generally, such patients don't actually continue on in the study on their whatever therapy that they're prescribed, and continue to get the treatment business after they discontinue. And I think we can go to the next slide, and I think it's back over to you, David, after that. So there's some real important questions related to the things that happen to a patient once they get in the study, and which can dramatically impact that, as shown in the first bullet. After treatment initiation, something can happen, and what they get put on afterwards or not can actually substantially impact the clinical question of interest, which is how do the people respond when they're taking the treatment. Discontinuation of assigned treatment is an example of an event like this. And the reason they discontinue, for example, if it's not due to the drug being perceived or not being effective or not being tolerated, is an important reason for discontinuation, and that missing information has to be handled in some way. And then the patient, the confounding thing, and David will get into more about this with the Estimand, is if they do happen to stop their randomized treatment and take another treatment in the study, which may be the same as or more intensive than any of the treatments that the study could randomize them to receive, how should that data be handled, and how, because it has a major impact on the primary clinical question of interest, and what happens when they take the subsequent therapy is reflecting that rather than specifically what they took as part of the randomized treatment in the trial. And I think over to you now, David.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, so I'm now going to sort of go back. Imagine you're sort of, we're going to time travel now. We're going back in time. So obviously we've presented the results, we've presented to you the design of the Ethos trial. But imagine you were Paul, many years ago when you were trying to think about how you would design the study. So that's what and that's how you should think about Estimands. We need to sort of think of it at the beginning, and this will become a bit clearer on this slide. So obviously we've spoken a little bit about the study design so far, but the whole idea of one of the big ticket items with the Estimand framework is for you to think about things from the beginning, from the top. And so the first thing you would like to know is, what do you actually want to find out? And so here we've already told you that the interest is in the triple combination, and we want to make a comparison with the two duals. And we'd like to be able to demonstrate superiority of the triple combination over the dual therapies in the treatment of COPD. Yeah, so that's what we'd like to do. And there's an added wrinkle that there are 2 doses of the triple in this study, and we'd like to show that both of those doses were superior to the 2 duals. Efficacy is measured in various different ways in COPD, but one of the main ways of measuring is in terms of exacerbations. And if you take all of that together, that helps inform the design of the Ethos trial. And so that gives you an idea that, you see, at the moment we're not talking about the methods, about how we're going to analyze, in this case, exacerbations and things like that. So that comes later, but this top-down process is important. So a little bit more information on the Estimand. So to define an Estimand, that is, what do you want to find out in your study? Okay, so to do that, we need to define 5 things. Some of them will be more familiar than others. So the treatment conditions, so that's, what are we comparing with what? The population, so that particularly, and this is an important point, some of you are more statistical nature might think the population means, are we talking about ITT or modified ITT? We're not. Population means the patient population that you're studying. In this case, we're thinking of a certain subset of COPD patients. But the endpoint, I've already said that we're interested in exacerbations. The population summary measure in the Ethos study was the rate of exacerbations. So that's 4 of the 5 things explained. The 5th one is this sort of new word, intercurrent events. So for that we mean, and Paul already gave the wording for it on a previous slide, so things that happen after the initiation of the therapy that have an impact on your ability to determine the outcome. So there are a variety of things like that, but one such example is treatment discontinuation, because by discontinuing treatment and then maybe taking another treatment, that's going to have an impact on their future rate of exacerbations, or it could do. So that is an example of an intercurrent event. So you might be there thinking, well, who decides on on this, the choice of Estimand? And the answer is this is a team game, and so that's one of the reasons we're both here today. It's not a clinical decision by itself. It's not a statistical decision. It's a joint decision, and of course, it's not just between those two professions. There's lots of other disciplines involved when you're deciding the design of a clinical study for actually to make it feasible. And then, of course, there are other people involved, which the regulators as well will have a view, because obviously this trial was done with them in mind. So you have to do a study that's they're going to be happy with and is going to address the questions that they're interested in. So this is it's a team game. And the advantage of using the framework and defining these things up front is enormous, in my view, because if you sort of gloss over it, later on in the process, you'll find out that somebody, maybe a regulator or so, they had a different idea about what was the aim of the study, or indeed what you were measuring, or lots of things can go wrong. Lots of things still do go wrong, unfortunately, but with using this framework, hopefully you can have a clarity on what the trial is supposed to be investigating, what we're trying to measure, and what success looks like. And so at the end of the process, it should be more straightforward than maybe it has been historically, when some sort of arguments or disagreements have broken out, where different people thought that different questions were actually being asked. Okay, so let's go into some details now with the Ethos study and use the framework. So we now, I think one of the things just to then add an extra layer to here is, I'd mentioned that treatment discontinuation is an example of an intercurrent event, but I'd like to sort of have subclasses of treatment discontinuation, i.e. different reasons for it, two of which are due to lack of efficacy or due to an adverse event. And obviously, if you think about that, those are clearly providing information that says, well, the assigned treatment wasn't that good for that patient at that time, because the first one, they were saying it didn't work for them and they wanted to go on to something else. The other one had an adverse event that stopped them using it subsequently. The third reason could be lots of other reasons, some of which are specified when you do a clinical trial, but others, there might be no reason given. And so in those third categories, it's a bit unclear whether that's evidence against the treatment that was originally assigned. You have no idea clearly if no reason was given. And the question I'd like to pose is, are the data collected after the patient discontinues their originally assigned therapy and then starts another therapy, are they relevant to understanding the efficacy of the assigned therapy, the initial therapy? So that's just something for you to think about as you're going through this. So let's go on a bit. So if you haven't read the ICH E9R1 addendum, it's a good read, and part of it details 5 possible intercurrent event strategies. I'm just going to give you a flavor for them now. The first of which is called treatment policy, and that is a strategy that's used where you think that the outcome after the intercurrent event is still of interest. So the question I pose to you, they're saying, in that particular case, no, what happens after people stop taking therapy and move on to other therapies is still relevant to their question of interest. And if that's the case, then you would use a treatment policy approach. An alternative is that you might think that the actual intercurrent event is informative for the effect of interest. And so for example, you think that people who discontinue due to treatment due to lack of efficacy tells you something about the efficacy of the product, which you could strongly argue it does, you might be able to incorporate that in into a composite endpoint. And then that's a composite strategy. The third type is a hypothetical approach, where you say, well, what would have happened if that intercurrent event had not occurred, i.e. if patients hadn't stopped therapy or discontinued therapy. I'll talk less or hardly at all about the principal stratum approach, because there it's of relevance if you can define the population of patients who wouldn't have discontinued treatment in the future. And again, unless you have a time machine, that's impossible to do in this scenario. So we'll discount that approach here. The while on treatment approach is one where you say, well, I'm just interested in what was the benefit while they were taking the treatment. Okay, so let's go on and take you through the three possible estimands that could be used in this trial. The first one is, I'll just build the slide, there you go, the hypothetical estimand. So we're interested in the annual rate, that's the population summary measure, of moderate to severe exacerbations, the endpoint, hence the colour scheme, in patients with, and then the patients that were recruited to the Ethos trial were symptomatic, they were suffering from moderate to severe COPD, and they're currently treated with either a dual or a triple inhaled therapy. And at the moment, I'm just going to concentrate on one of the comparisons. Earlier on, I'd mentioned that we want to compare the triple with both duals, and we want to compare both doses of the triple with both duals. But for simplicity, I'll just focus on one comparison, the high dose triple, compare it with the combination of glycopyrronium furothorol, GFF for short. The hypothetical strategy for dealing with treatment discontinuation is to think about what would have happened if they hadn't have discontinued treatment. So that's the hypothetical estimand written down. Let's move on to a sort of a new estimand that was devised as part of this trial called the attributable estimand. And this you can think of as a hybrid of a composite and hypothetical estimand. Here we're interested in the annual rate of moderate to severe exacerbations, but note, if someone discontinues for what are called attributable reasons, and we'll take that discontinuation due to two reasons, lack of efficacy or adverse events, a poor response will be imputed for them after they discontinue. The rest of it is the same as it was for the hypothetical until the bottom, where it's the same as the hypothetical, but only for patients who discontinue treatment for non-attributable reasons. And so that's if, for example, as Paul alluded to, maybe somebody just moves town, and so then we don't think that's due to the treatment at all, or the treatments they're on. Could have been, of course, but we don't think it is. And then the final one is the treatment policy estimand, which is easier to do, as it were, in some senses, if you have complete data. So this is the annual rate of moderate to severe exacerbations in the same patient population, same treatment comparison. And if people discontinue treatment, you follow them up and include all the information you have following that treatment discontinuation. So those are the sort of three options that I've put before you today for you to consider. So before we go on to get you to do some work instead of just me and Paul, let's just think about the missing data here. So the first thing to realize, or that's clearly explained in the addendum to E9, is that these things called intercurrent events and missing data are separate things. And so you can think in this case where somebody, that patient 2, they discontinue treatment because of an adverse event, and then they take another therapy, you know, what can happen to them in terms of after that point? If they discontinue the study at that point, and we're interested in the hypothetical estimand, then it doesn't matter the data after that point. Does it work? Yeah. Sorry, but that's regardless of whether they discontinue from the study. So the data after they discontinue treatment is not missing. It can't be missing because you're not interested in it. Okay. So that's why there's a big arrow at the bottom there. Only data prior to that event are relevant. It's only patient 4 where you can have imputation issues here. Okay, so that it's because there we just don't know what happened. Followed up for a certain amount of time, and then but they didn't discontinue treatment as such. They just disappeared. Okay. If we take the same approach for the attributable Estimand, you see the similar sort of thing here in terms of, again, only data up until treatment discontinuation are relevant, but obviously now it depends on the reason for the discontinuation about how we then handle the data, but that's not a missing data problem. The missing data problem is only the 4th patient. And then for treatment policy, then it's possible to have missing data for patients 2, 3, and 4, because you want to follow people up for 52 weeks. And if you haven't done that, you've got missing data. Okay, so it's time for me to stop talking briefly for us to check some technology and see if we can get you to vote on the following question. So imagine you're a regulator and you've got to decide whether or not to license BGF. Right, so has it demonstrated efficacy? And you've got to pick one Estimand strategy, just thinking about treatment discontinuation. And so what I've told you today, would you pick the hypothetical Estimand as though that intercurrent event hadn't happened? Would you pick the attributable Estimand that sort of picks apart the reason for treatment discontinuation and sort of uses a poor response if patients are discontinued for attributable reasons like lack of efficacy or adverse events? Or would you pick the treatment policy approach where all the data is used, including the data after treatment discontinuation? So over to you. I look forward to hearing the results. So we'll just have a little break while you do that. So I'm just checking in the background that that's happening. Is everything on course?
Yeah, we've currently got 60% voted so far.
Okay, please go. You know, there's lots of things that have happened over the last few years where not many people have voted. You have to live by that, so you'll be held accountable for how you're voting. So keep going, guys. Okay, that's probably long enough. Is that, we see the, how did it go? Well, look at that. So that's nice to see a split. And it's one of the, you know, we definitely can't all agree on these things. And it's nice to see a split on different choices, but it looks like it's about 60% attributable, a third treatment policy, and a few hypotheticals. So that's, thank you very much for that. And I think we can move on and hear a little bit about what Paul thinks about this. So over to you, Paul.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is a really, really important question when looking at these things. I guess I'll start with the second bullet about the treatment policy Estimand, and the question of clinical interest may relate to what happens to somebody when they come in and take a treatment and you can't predict whether they're going to respond to it or not, whether they're going to tolerate it or not, and such, so that those intercurrent events, if you will, may not be predictable. And that's in fact what happens in clinical practice every day. Somebody comes in, they have a set of symptoms, you look at what they're on, and if they're not responding, you make appropriate adjustments and then follow them in their clinical course. I think that where it can break down, I think the argument breaks down a lot, but where it definitely breaks down is when there's I mean, you can also make an argument that some clinical trials are really not looking at the clinical practice question that I just posed per se, and especially in studies where we're having our main interest is in evaluating how treatment A compares to treatment B while they're taking those treatments, and recognizing that patients who come into the studies may or may not, I mean, it's just the three basic things. When you come into the study, you can get exactly what you need, more than you need, or less than you need. And you can step across from class to less intensive therapies and more intensive therapies. And that has a very huge impact on what happens after a patient discontinues therapies and why. And so I think the attributability, and I would say this, I think in somebody who comes in on, I'm just going to make this up, but somebody who comes in on a triple therapy and is symptomatic and is randomized to a dual therapy, those intercurrent events, in my view, are predictable. They're not in any way or shape related to the unpredictability when you put somebody who comes in on one therapy and escalate their therapy. And so I don't, so what happens to them after they stop that therapy and get a more intensive therapy is really a bias. There's many therapies that could be chosen from, and it's not at all connected to the reason why the study was done in the first place. So all of those things put together, I would vote for the attributable Estimand, because at least makes an effort to look at intercurrent events individually and then apply something based on data collected during the study from the entire population to account for the missing data in those with attributable events. And so for that reason, I would pick that one. But if we go on to the next slide, just to look at the primary endpoints, this is sort of predictable. We can focus on the top part of this because we had 2 ICS doses in the study. We really are only interested in the top one, which is the higher dose triple BGF 320, and we have it there versus GFF. We're just showing the GFF comparisons here as an example for the hypothetical Estimand, which is the top one, the attributable Estimand, which is the middle box plot, and then the treatment policy, which is the lower one. And you can see the first two, if you look at the 0.76 is the rate ratio, and it was essentially the same for both the efficacy and the attributable Estimand, which is kind of interesting. The missing data that was occurred as a result of lack of efficacy and tolerability in this particular case did not make a big difference on the estimated treatment differences between, for example, BGF and GFF. And the treatment policy Estimand, you can see there's a substantial reduction in the rate ratio. It goes from 0.76 to 0.82, meaning a 24% versus an 18% reduction. And that's very predictable because many of the people who discontinued therapy got put on more intensive therapies, and more of those happened in the GFF arm than the BGF arm. So there's the two factors that are playing a role. Not only is it predictable that more people would discontinue, but more people who discontinued got a more intensive therapy in the GFF arm compared to the others. You can't see that from the data, but that's the actual explanation behind it. I think we can go to the next slide. Let's get maybe back over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Paul. And just to say, yes, I forgot to update this last slide there, but Paul will also give his view on communication in medical journals in a little bit as well. But so let's just start off with a blizzard picture here. So I'm not expecting you to absorb this picture, but just this is was published in the New England Journal of Medicine primary manuscript, and I'm sure it's very familiar to many of you. The style of it, this is sort of what you do in clinical trials. You put this sort of thing in the paper. That's what people expect you to do, and it has a lot of helpful information in there. But I'd just like to highlight that the Estimand framework allows you to get even more out of stuff than this that appears in this diagram. So, you know, for example, thinking about treatment discontinuation and then what happened to patients after they discontinued treatment. So you don't really get that from this. You know that they didn't complete 52 weeks of treatment, the ones who discontinued, but what happened to them after that, as it were. And so that there are subtleties. I mean, and obviously in terms of, there'll be some situations where people are followed up until the end of the trial, so there's no missing data for them, even though they discontinued treatment, and others for which there aren't. So that there's all sorts of additional pieces of information that are of interest, and they're relevant if you're interested in a particular Estimand. So it's a way that maybe these sort of pictures could be improved and made more dynamic if you're interested in particular questions, especially as we go into a more future world when that might be possible. So yeah, so that's I think just a comment on this style of diagram. If you do just focus on a few of the numbers here, you'll see that the ones in the dual arms, there's more people discontinued, as Paul was saying, you might expect, and then indeed people who are discontinuing due to lack of efficacy is higher in the dual arms than the triple arms. So you get sort of a sense that that's conveying a message in itself, which is useful to know. Okay, so in terms of communication in journals, I'd just like to move on to that. And the first thing I'd like to flag up really is, you know, what is this paper for? So paper is for many different, is useful for very different reasons. The company, in this case, AstraZeneca, obviously it's their primary publication, is very important to us. But of course, in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, the paper still has relevance for other reasons, for when it's being used maybe as part of a meta-analysis later on. And if there isn't clarity on what was actually done in the primary manuscript, this is going to lead to problems down the road. So that's the first thing. Just don't necessarily think of it, and this is maybe sometimes how journals might look at things. They say, well, no, the primary approach was this, report that in the manuscript. Don't talk about anything else. There are some good statistical reasons for making sure that sponsors are held to account and make sure that is reported. But also different stakeholders might think, hold on, I'm not interested in that question. I'm interested in a different question. Can I find it in this paper? And if the answer is no, then they might say, oh, okay, well, we'll just use the results anyway for their slightly different question. And that can be a problem. So I think, you know, that's the first thing I'd like to explain. The second thing is here, you know, I've talked about 3 different Estimands that you could use. And in the paper, we were fortunate enough to have the attributable Estimand form a brief section of the paper. So it's in there, but it's got, I would say, sort of a little bit of information. They're not as much as we would like. You know, we had a fight with the journal, and Paul might talk about that in a little bit. The other thing that, you know, so I'd mentioned this already about it's not just now, it's later, but it's also who is interested in the results of this. So the regulators are, individual clinicians, the actual patient, later on the people who decide whether or not they should pay for these drugs. So there are lots of different stakeholders, and they will clearly have quite different stances on information they're interested in. Moving on to, I've mentioned that space is limited in these journals, and that can preclude having a sort of a great section explaining all of this, starting off with a clinical objective and having that flow. So I think there's work we need to do there to encourage journals to move away from what they're used to, and that there are ways they could do that. We'll talk a little bit about that when Paul responds in a minute, I think. So yeah, no, I think maybe that is a good time just to hand over to Paul. I mean, can you relate a little bit about the experience of dealing with the journal, if you don't mind?
Yeah, definitely happy to do that. I must admit, as a clinician coming into Pearl/AZ a number of years ago. I had never heard the term Estimand before. I thought, well, these guys don't know what they're talking about. They can't even spell the word estimate properly. So this has opened up an entire new dialogue with terms that are not generally understood and definitely not widely disseminated, at least within the clinical arena. We ran into this head on with the New England Journal. The primary statistical reviewer for the journal was not familiar with that terminology. We had to have several phone calls with the journal, with the statistical reviewer, to help them understand what these different terms were and what they meant. Spent a great deal of time crafting language that would be understandable, because clinicians, when they read this, they're looking, well, how does it compare to the other drugs that I'm familiar with that were traditionally done using the hypothetical estimate, and now all of a sudden we're coming up with something very different that's not understandable. So that is a challenge. The good news, I guess, one of the other pieces that I'll just briefly mention is that journals are not at all, I mean, they haven't changed a lot their requirements for what can go in the main part of the publication, but there's, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, we've probably had a supplement to the main article that was bigger than the article itself and contained a lot of detail on the statistical analysis plan and the definitions of terms and how the population sorted out and how intercurrent events sorted out within the various treatment groups, and a whole bunch of other supplementary information that the main journal wouldn't fit in the publication that most people will see when they open up the New England Journal. So that has becoming much more widespread and does allow an opportunity to dig into that for those that are interested in some of the additional details, which I know I am when I read them. I always ask for the supplements, because that usually has a lot of things in there that are relevant that aren't necessarily transparent in the main paper.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Paul. And I just maybe add that, I suppose it's just how we sort of migrate to make that even, make it that better, really, in terms of how we persuade the journals to have a, someone say, well, I'm a patient, I'm interested in this aspect, and that sort of, you're driven to one particular section of a document or something like this that sort of explains things to them in a good way. I know the FDA have been working on these sort of snapshots to try and explain what the benefit of a treatment is to a patient. So there are various things ongoing, and that's areas that can be worked on, I think, especially with the Estimand language too. But anyway, we should move on, and I will just now wrap up with a brief conclusion. So hopefully I've demonstrated to you what a powerful tool that Estimand creates, and how that framework is really helpful when considering different questions different stakeholders might have. One of the difficulties that was had when communicating this in the journal was, you could say, well, we have an endpoint, it's exacerbations, or it's a rate, exacerbation rate, and then to explain that you've got different estimands that will give you different answers for that one particular endpoint was confusing to the people at the journal. So this required a whole lot of effort. So we need to sort of move away from the endpoint and think about the Estimand. And of course, you have to predefine all this, as you would expect. I was delighted, obviously, that we'd seem to have convinced, hopefully, I'm sure, quite a biased audience, but who cares, that the majority quite liked the idea of the attributable Estimand, because, in terms of this particular scenario that you're interested in, is this triple combination a good thing? And by that we mean, is it a good thing to register it and to license it? And that means that you are interested in that initially assigned therapy. That's a sort of a crucial thing, which sometimes seems to get lost when people think about treatment policy sometimes, and think about this and say, well, that's the real world, that's what happens. It is the real world, but that doesn't really help you know which medications you should be prescribing at the beginning of that journey. So, and then let's move on to the last bit. So yes, the learning outcomes, hopefully now you're a little bit more comfortable how you might choose an Estimand in a respiratory setting, specifically in COPD, and also how you might think about including that information in a medical journal, and fights you might like to have to improve on that if a journal comes back not maybe getting what you're talking about. Okay, so the final thing before we go to the Q&A is just to say that's not the end. It's nearly the end of the year, of course, and we're delighted that the Estimand Academy has been able to deliver 3 webinars this year, but we're not going to give up. So there'll be more coming next year. So for those of you who are interested, watch out for more webinars next year on Estimand topics using real case studies. So now it's time to have Q&A. We've got plenty of time for that. So over to Sue to help me with that.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Paul, for a very clear presentation and sharing your experience of the Ethos study and also publishing your work. So just want to encourage folks on the call to submit your Q&A questions in the Q&A panel, please. I'm going to just kick off with one of my own questions, just, you know, take advantage of my position here in the chair, and then we'll go over to some of the other questions from there. So can I go to Paul first of all and just ask a sort of quite general question of, have Estimands actually changed how you approach protocol development?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes, they have. We're getting more and more communications, at least from some regulatory agencies, that they expect they're getting more and more adamant about the treatment policy Estimand being the primary Estimand of interest, knowing that that blunts the treatment effect size that has to be compensated for in the design. So the studies have to be larger, powered for smaller treatment effect size differences, and therefore become more costly and take longer. So that's a very practical implication of how that Estimand is driving how the designs are studied.
And thank you, Paul. David, do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, just say that I see it across my company, across different companies, that you know, the Estimand framework is being used, and I think it has changed. And I think the other thing I'd add is that I learn something each time that I use the framework, as it were, because you go through what's going to happen in the trial, and then by using it, someone will say, well, what about this? And you go, and it's a great way of seeing off problems, as it were, because they say, oh, okay, no, we didn't realize that that would be an issue, or we could design the study this way or that way, and that will obviously impact whether that intercurrent event will happen, the frequency it will happen, etc. And so there can be a discussion about that at that stage, whereas previously sometimes that was overlooked, and then later on in some trials it didn't matter, and in other trials it made a big difference, which is, of course, a tremendous waste for everyone, all the patients involved in the study, and you know, the potential treatment sometimes has floundered when it might not have done. So that's what I found that matter.
Okay, so I'm going to go to a question thinking about those things that might happen in the study or in clinical practice. There's a question: how did we handle temporary discontinuations of treatment that may include 2 categories due to the tardiness by the patient or recommended by the investigator? So any sort of pauses in treatment? Maybe Paul could comment on that first.
Yeah, I can certainly comment on that. I mean, we had criteria set up in the study. So if somebody was admitted to the hospital, for example, or had a very severe event, they were allowed to get whatever therapy the investigator thought was appropriate for some period of time. And then they were we sort of changed some of this as the studies, as we learned more, but with the intent that they have to switch back to their investigational product and just continue the other therapies, which would have been mandated as exclusionary meds for the study within a certain period of time, or if they would be considered a treatment failure and dropped out of the study. We did have people that had to have that for a period of time, and in general, we didn't lose a lot of data as a result of that, because if they'd had an exacerbation and were scheduled to get a spirometry, that visit was often rescheduled so that the data wasn't lost, but also not confounded by acute things that would happen in response to having had an acute exacerbation of their COPD, which definitely makes lung function and those sorts of things worse.
So David, if what's your take on that? If somebody discontinues treatment for a while and you were to sort of write that into the Estimand, how would that have been reflected in the Estimand?
Sure. Well, I mean, from in the attributable Estimand, it's very easy to do. That would just be a different type of treatment discontinuation, and then you would decide whether or not that's attributable or not, and then you could then carry it through as it was before. I mean, I suppose in principle, I think, but I think the difference, I suppose, in the trial is, well, especially if you're on the triple, you don't know what you're on, of course, but then if you stop that treatment, you can't wander off and get it somewhere else. That actual triple, you can get a different triple, and so that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. But I think the main thing here was, big ticket events when people discontinued, and then because of a big event like lack of efficacy, adverse events.
And just to maybe add a little bit color to that, so I don't think we have to handle differently temporary discontinues as part of the disease under study. I mean, because it's not the same as somebody who permanently discontinues drug. One of the implications of it, like especially in a study where we're looking at exacerbations, we exclude periods that under which the exacerbation has occurred, or there's a beginning and an end that we have to define. And that has an impact on their, quote, time at risk for developing an exacerbation. That is accounted for so in the analysis plan, but it's not considered from handling of data standpoint, that the data as I mentioned, in most cases we get the data anyway, if it was things like lung function as well, and the treatment, whether on IP, is a temporary time in response to treating an exacerbation, which isn't counted as part of efficacy stuff in general anyway. If that makes sense.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. So a question from Paul. Presumably the point estimate of the attributable Estimand can be influenced by what value is deemed as a poor response. So how do you decide what to use? David, did you want to, or Paul? Yeah,
yeah,
Paul. Okay.
I can certainly take a stab at it. I know what we do in the study. So, for example, we will, if somebody, I'll just use FEV1 as an example. So if somebody discontinued due to lack of efficacy, what value is imputed for missing values attributable to the lack of efficacy? And for things where improvements represent a positive value, like for lung function, we would take the 5th percentile for observed responses across the study and impute that value going forward. And for things where reductions in represent an improvement, so for example, things like quality of life, like SGRQ scores, with the 95th percentile. So essentially it's taking the small percentage that doesn't respond at all and imputing that value forward for that type of endpoint.
So you're taking a value on the worst end of the distribution from the control group, is that right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Well,
okay.
No. Well, actually, I think it's from. Yeah, I think it's from the the treatment groups in general, because it doesn't handle. That is one of kind of the interesting things. If you start looking at other Estimands, you could, when you start looking at subgroups and things like that, then that becomes a little bit more complicated on how to apply Estimands for an event that looks over the whole population versus Estimands that occur within a specific subgroup like gender, male, female, ethnicity, et cetera, becomes a little bit more complicated to handle with the attributable Estimand for sure.
Sure. And just to add, obviously, behind Paul's question is obviously somebody could argue and say, well, I don't like that approach. Maybe it should have been the 4th percent or the 6%. It's not set in stone. And obviously, you can do further analyses if people disagree on what a poor response should be. And so from that point of view, I don't think that's necessarily the end of the world. I would just sort of turn the question around the other way. And isn't it better to ask the right question and then say, oh, now we've got to make an assumption here, and so this is the assumption we're going to make about what a poor outcome is, rather than do what the sort of treatment policy approach is, which you sort of ask a different question which you're not really interested in, for which you don't then have to make any assumptions. So from that point of view, that's the rub. You either get something that's easy to do that gives you in principle looks at a different question, or something that's a bit harder to do and has assumptions. And so that's the dilemma, but I would always prefer to try and answer the right question.
So in terms of that, exploring what to use for that poor response, you're sort of touching on the idea of maybe sensitivity analyses there, David, and there's a question about sensitivity analysis and whether last observation carry forward was used. And I wonder if you'd want to comment on that.
It definitely wasn't for what we described, because we were talking about rate. But obviously, in terms of for FEV1, Paul might be able to help me what was actually used, but I don't think it was from memory. But
no, anything that was imputed for missing data for that used the repeated measures model to impute for missing data rather than the last observation carried forward.
Yeah, and so and we could articulate the issues with LOCF, but we can probably leave that here. But obviously there are lots of different problems with using that approach.
Okay, so there's a question around the journals. Given your experience with the New England Journal of Medicine, do you foresee that in the future journals like these may require some dedicated discussion on the Estimands? I'll ask that bit first. There's a little bit more to the question, but let's ask that first. Do you think journals will require more dedicated discussion on the Estimands?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog here right now. For the primary Estimands have traditionally been the hypothetical Estimand, which I think has been relatively well understood without having to put a bunch of terminology around it by clinicians. But there's now a move afoot, and the FDA is certainly leading the charge here. Europe is not too far behind, but they have some different requirements where the primary Estimand is no longer going to be acceptable to be the efficacy Estimand. And so that creates two very practical problems. So there can't be a different primary analysis approach for a journal article and for a regulatory submission. They have to match up, because what's going to happen is that whatever Estimand the regulators tell us to use or require us to use, that's what's going to end up in prescribing information, and therefore there's going to be a need to sync these things across things that are out in the public domain, and there is no understanding of what those other Estimands mean and how they link up to the Estimand they're used to seeing, even though they never referred to it in that way. So that is going to create a big challenge across the board, I think, in how these things are communicated in the public domain going forward.
Yeah, just on that bit, the first bit of the question, can I just add that, I mean, it's the way the question's worded is interesting. So about, you know, is there a need? I'd say, well, definitely there is a need. At the moment, the issue is obviously whether all the journals are aware of that need. Obviously, having that conversation and having a particular section, I think, would be immensely valuable for people to articulate what they were doing in the trial. I know that, you know, as Paul's saying, that people say, well, I know what it is, but, you know, it can't hurt to write it down. So from that point of view, I think that would be great if it happened.
And we had to put language, understandable language, in the main manuscript about the Estimand. So we had to explain the attributable Estimand in particular, because it was the primary endpoint was rate of exacerbations using the hypothetical Estimand, and our first secondary endpoint was rate of exacerbations using the attributable Estimand. So we had to explain what that meant in the text, in the main part of the paper, in an understandable way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's worth taking a look at for anyone that's not had chance. I think the link was in the flyer, wasn't it? Yeah, and there's also a supplement with the more for the statistical amongst the audience that want to delve into the deeper details. There is a supplement as well. So that the next bit of the question, though, on the journal is quite interesting in terms of, would you recommend that the journals have some kind of standardization and in terms of their expectations? And that it actually says in terms of some key treatment strategy results to be presented, keeping some of the larger end goals like future meta-analyses in mind. So I guess that's touching on sort of the purpose of giving detail and the potential uses of giving that detail in the journal.
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, I think some of it is going to be forced upon us. So whether the journals want it or not, they're going to get it, because it's going to have to, as I mentioned before, match up with what was done in support. I mean, there's two classes of articles. If it's not a registration study, then they can do whatever they want. So there may be a I mean, you brought up stuff that's just going to have major implications. So, for example, it's going to have to be that whatever is the primary Estimand that's agreed with, and it's going to end up being in product labels, is going to have to match up in the public domain for those things. But there's a whole group of papers where that's not a regulatory paper, and so whether that's still required there or not. And you raise a hugely important issue about how do you do a meta-analysis now going forward when there's 3 different Estimands, or maybe more, maybe other hybrid Estimands that are going to come place, and how do you compare A to B to C to D, because they're all different and they're not directly comparable, really.
Yeah. So absolutely. So, and I think it's relevant to product labels, but also to the primary manuscript. So having this sort of clear information on different Estimands for different intercurrent events, and that reminds me, slap wrist for me, I forgot to mention that you don't have to use the same intercurrent, the strategy for handling the intercurrent events. It shouldn't be this, doesn't have to be the same for each one. So if you look at different intercurrent events, you can use a different strategy. And then that gets into an added layer of complexity, because somebody says, what was your Estimand? And you say, well, it was part treatment policy, and it was part hypothetical, and it was part something else, which is a little bit what the attributable Estimand is. So communicating that gets more difficult. But I think having all those options on the table can be incredibly valuable to future researchers who might be asking a slightly different question. We don't even know what it is yet, because it's going to be 5 years in the future. And then they go, oh, I'm interested in this. Have they got a way of getting that information out of the study? They might do, or they might not. But, you know, it's making that as possible, making it sort of possible, I think could be immensely valuable to future research. So it's something to aspire to.
Yeah, I know that, Paul, you were mentioning how the treatment policy Estimand sort of confounds things and dilutes the treatment effect down effectively. So you've got a smaller treatment effect, And there's a question around sample size. Did you provide sample size for each of the different Estimands, hypothetical treatment policy and the mix, the attributable? What sample size, do you actually use? What's the advice for sample size going forward?
Yeah, I mean, those are really great sort of questions for the ages, really. In Ethos and in the studies that were part of the development program, that transition was being talked about but hadn't made yet. As a matter of fact, we provided our strategy for our Estimand strategy in a massive STAP to the agency to comment on, and what our approach was, which they didn't actually comment on. But in this particular study, it didn't matter because we achieved significance for all three Estimands. So it didn't matter. But this is a unique exception because we had a huge sample overall anyway, and so the magnitude of the rates that were observed in the study, as we were looking at them in a blinded fashion along the way, we're meeting with expectations for what we assumed the background rates were. So there was no real necessary need to adjust sample size up or down. We did have a blinded sample size re-estimation as part of the study, just in part to assess whether they were as expected. Most people know today, if they're doing studies, that COVID has had a huge impact on that. So you might be expecting you're going to see a background rate of 1.3 exacerbations per patient per year, and they get in the study in COVID now and it's 0.5 or something like that, which has its own sort of significant impact. But I think, unless there's some prior agreement with the agency, I think we're going to be more and more forced to assume that they're going to be held to currently the treatment policy Estimand as the primary Estimand of interest in the study, and that's going to result in lower effect sizes and higher sample sizes as a result.
Thank you. And David, do you have anything to add in terms of what should drive the sample size? Should we be sample sizing for all these Estimands, or what would be the advice?
I mean, yeah, from a statistical point of view, of course, that's relevant to the discussions that if you know that different stakeholders might be interested in different Estimands, obviously it's pointless powering it if you only power it for the primary, but then that's the primary for one person, but there's somebody else down the road is also going to need this for some, and you haven't looked at that. Obviously that's an oversight. So of course you need to look at it for the main stakeholders that's going to impact your product if you're in the pharmaceutical industry, in terms of whether or not A, you'll get approval, and B, you'll get reimbursement. So those are the two that you need to definitely look at. But you might then have a problem with different regulators have different Estimands that they're interested in. So clearly you need to look at that too. So yeah, that would be general background things you have to look at.
And I mean, just maybe to add one more thing to that, sorry, because I do think we face this now all the time. I mean, when we did these studies, we had to deal with 3 different regulatory authorities, some of whom wanted landmark time points like the US, some of whom wanted time points over the entire treatment period like Europe, and some of them wanted evaluation of whatever endpoint you're looking at over a 12 to 24 week treatment period, if it was a 24-week study, for example. And so we had to accommodate all of those. In general, it's much like this. We know the over the treatment periods are more powerful and therefore require smaller sample size. We also generally know that the one that's going to require the greatest sample size is going to be the treatment policy. The other two tend to have, for the same sample size, would have more power, and so they would be accommodated in most cases by the treatment policy, but not necessarily the other way around.
Mm-hmm. But just to be clear, it does, obviously with the attributable Estimand, it does depend on the scenarios. Now there will be scenarios where you need more for that, and that's just something you just can't. You can do simulations for that, and it starts to get very complicated in some circumstances. If you've got, you don't know whether you've got a good treatment or a bad treatment when you do the study. And so it depends what actually is going to happen.
Yeah, there's a question here that I wonder whether it might be connected to, whether we should be thinking about the design of our CRF forms. But the question is, what strategies did you use to reduce any risk of subjective classification of reasons for treatment discontinuation? So, you know, you're obviously placing a lot of emphasis on the reason for the treatment discontinuation. So how are we capturing that, trying to capture that accurately?
Yeah, I do think our case report forms were not as granular as they probably could have been. And so, for example, you know, a physician or a patient may discontinue in the category of subject discretion or physician discretion. Well, what does that mean? So we ended up having to go back and look at some of those things, well, look at all of those events individually, and looking at free text fields to try to find out if what was behind, what does that mean? The patient wasn't doing well. You know, does that mean, is that what it meant? Or was it something, you know, the patient just said, I'm tired, I don't want to do this anymore. And even then, that could still be buried lack of efficacy or something that didn't get captured appropriately. So there are some shortfalls in that where I think we would be better off being more specific for some of the categories that we capture. Another good example is when people discontinue treatment due to some protocol specified discontinuation criteria. Is that an attributable event? And you have to look at those individually. So somebody who has a rise in liver function test, but the investigator didn't think it was a drug-related adverse event, we have to do a little digging on that to try to make sure did the patient have a history of prior LFT abnormalities and, you know, the sort of gallbladder disease or something that could have explained it. So we do end up having to do a lot of work at the blinded data level to try to make determinations about whether some of those things are attributable or not. I think it's a great comment, because I do think we do need to do a better job to make our lives easier on the back end.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think it's practical to have a CRF page that asks the question, was the reason for treatment discontinuation attributable or not attributable or unknown? Is that actually a question we should be asking?
We don't ask it in that way. We do ask if the discontinuation was due to lack of efficacy or an adverse event. So we don't say, we don't give them the attributability stuff. So if it was an adverse event, it has to be drug related, and so you can do all that stuff programmatically. If they were discontinued due to an adverse event, but it wasn't related to the treatment, then we don't count that and stuff like that.
But yeah, no, it's a great question in terms of making sure that when you design a study, when you've chosen the Estimand and then designing the study is complicated, as it were, and then there is this knock-on effect at the back end. And as Paul said, it was a hell of a lot of work after the event to sort of dig down and make sure that, you know, this was all explored appropriately, which it was. But of course, there are efficiency gains in this massive trial that we could have gained by doing it in a different way. So, but of course, and you have to think about that, whether it's a primary Estimand or a tertiary one, how much effort are you going to put into that? In some senses as well, because of course it might have cost implications and things like that. So it is an interesting area.
Okay, thank you. There's a question on the principal stratum strategy, which I don't know whether we want to touch on, but yeah, would that be the most appropriate for preserving estimation of, sorry, it's just moved on my screen. Estimation of average treatment causal effects in trials where there are intercurrent events, especially if imbalance between the randomized arms. So that's the kind of question, David, that is going to make most non-statisticians glaze over. Is there anything we can pull from that might help a wider audience?
Well, only briefly that in theory, yes, but obviously when you do the analysis, there's loads of assumptions that you have to make to come up with that analysis. So it might have some value in some circumstances, but here I struggle in the clinical situation we're in, where you say, well, if you could identify patients that would discontinue treatment, you say, well, you can't. And so that's the area I struggle with from a holistic point of view. about this. And so,
So presumably this kind of question though is what would be the treatment effect in those who were able to tolerate the triple? What's the advantage of the triple over the double in those who would be able to tolerate, you know, either one or something like that? That you're phrasing the question like that, but you don't know if they could tolerate it because they didn't get it. That's the kind of question we're talking about here, isn't it? Is that right?
It is.
Yeah.
And so you get into what's called the counterfactual world, and it's sort of getting into the patient point of view. They're saying, you know, if you're sitting there with the clinician, they say, well, if I could tolerate this treatment, what would have been the benefit? And so it's a sensible question to ask, but it's just what we were talking about today. That's not relevant to well, it's not the primary question for a regulator to address, because they've got to look at the patients who don't tolerate the treatment as well as those who do. So they've got to look at it collectively. So I think it's definitely wrong from that point of view, but I agree that it does have some value from the patient point of view. And so maybe that analysis could be included in some part of the dossier or some part of the labeling later. But it has to then we get into the difficult question of explaining what that is and why patients should look at that treatment effect rather than the one that was in the trial. So,
okay. There's a question about safety. It looks like there are many patients who received treatment, but they were excluded from the safety population. What was the main reason driving this decision? I don't know if that's a misunderstanding, but could one of you speak to that?
I have to go back and look, but there were a number of people that were found to be duplicate subjects and things like that, that required, you know, we had preset rules, and they may have been taking more than one IP at the same time. So we had preset rules about whether any other data would be used, whether it all had to be excluded, and what the you know, like for example, if somebody ended up being a duplicate subject in another trial, we would use the safety data or use their data potentially up to the point where the offending other IP came into the picture and then eliminated after that. So that was the lion's share of those who were discontinued from safety population.
Okay, and on the subject of safety, do you have any thoughts at all on safety estimands?
I've not. Let's just say, I mean, I can tell you that what we're being asked to do on a more regular basis, but it's never hypothesis testing. So the Estimand issue hasn't really come up.
Sure, but I mean, I suppose the only thing I could say there was, if there was to be a safety Estimand, you have to think about what the efficacy Estimand is as well, and make sure that you're looking at things in the right way, because there can be sometimes, for example, when we're taking into account the tolerability in the attributable Estimand, so that's sort of taking into account some of the safety issues, not all of them, but some of them, in the way that we talk about the treatment effect there, where of course the hypothetical Estimand would not do that. So it's sort of, and it's when you make those comparisons between efficacy and safety, and then have to make a benefit risk evaluation, that the problems can start. So it's sort of how you do that is far from straightforward. But as Paul says, the difficulty here is to say what is a priori, what would you define as the safety of the product that you're concerned about? And it's a very nebulous question at that point, particularly for, you know, a new class of drug. Here, you might be able to make an argument for it because it's a combination of 3 established drug classes, sort of. So you know something about, you know that one of them gives you a dry mouth, you know one of them does X, you know these things, and you know that might be likely, but it's still far from straightforward. I would argue.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we'll just finish off with a last question. It says, is the most appropriate Estimand in a scenario where patients are stepped up versus standard of care different to the scenario where patients can be stepped down? And in brackets, it says, as was the case in Ethos.
Sure.
So is any thoughts on that one?
Oh yeah, loads of thoughts on that one. So,
Okay.
but it does. You've got a choice when you're doing these sort of studies. You can take people that are just as they are. Some of them are symptomatic and some of them are not. And say you took them all on dual therapy, and then you could randomize them to carry on that therapy and step up the patients as they need to. So that the thing is, they've got to be symptomatic. So I'm reversing again. Take symptomatic patients on the dual, and then you randomize patients to either step up or stay on what they are. There could be ethical problems with that because all the people on the duals, so maybe that won't work in the clinical situation. So what the problem Paul was faced with is, could he come up with a trial that was actually feasible? And so there was a little bit of compromise necessary in that to come up with a scenario where you've got patients who are on duals or triples who are symptomatic. And this, you might disagree, Paul, but I think there's no right answer. You have to do something.
I will just add one more element of complexity to that. It depends on what the standard of care is. Because what happens when somebody discontinues therapy and there's 5 or 6 options, and those 5 or 6 options aren't then randomly assigned? There's a lot of bias that gets introduced into the treatment decisions that are made post-treatment discontinuation, which also have a big impact on how you're going to interpret the effects using things like the treatment policy estimand, where on study data is used, as well as on treatment data.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we're pretty much out of time, so I just want to thank you again for your great presentations and taking the time to share your experiences. And also, thanks to PSI for hosting this session. There will be a recording made available, and we'll try and disseminate that information. I think it will go on the FPIA YouTube channel, as well as being linked to from the PSI website as well. So look out for that, and look out for our next webinars next year as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.